Yeah, I think that is quite difficult to describe because there isn't one style. And I think also the thing that is perhaps very different about Johannesburg from, say, Paris is that it's a much younger city. Also that, like many other cities in South Africa, Johannesburg has been, if you like, a victim of the apartheid regime. So it's very much a divided city, where there's a central part or historic central part to the city where there are very different people who live there now, but that is very separated from what were historically the townships. So Soweto, I think, is a very well-known Johannesburg township. And I think one of the kind of important things that people like myself and other people involved in the sort of built environment are very interested in doing is kind of bridging the gap between what is the kind of, I suppose, historic middle of Johannesburg and all the surrounding parts, and to kind of bridge the no man's land between, because as part of the regime of the apartheid years was to make it very difficult for people to move between white areas, black areas, etc. So I think that one of the important things that we are involved in doing as built environment professionals is to try to bridge that gap. I think that they're quite complex, but probably in many ways not as complex as I understand things are. In Europe, I'm perhaps more aware of things that go on in the UK, in England, in London. We have many regulations and we need to get approvals and things for things to be passed. And to be honest, it's got more and more and more difficult. The kind of red tape, if you like, has got very long and complicated. I think one of the interesting things is around heritage, something that I am quite interested in and involved with, where heritage laws have become part of how we need to operate. So if buildings are older than 60 years, then they become, I mean, which in France is very funny because, I mean, the buildings are much, much older than that. But a building that is of 60 years old, or anything significant that has significant historical or heritage value, then you need to go through the authorities also on that before you start going with respect to altering the building or changing the actual built environment. I must say, though, that there's a lot of disrespect for those things, and in many ways I think a lot of so much red tape that people eventually just get so frustrated by it that they're cowboys. I mean, they do whatever they feel like doing. It is very difficult for it can often slow up a development to such an extent that you can't afford to do the development because it takes so long to get it off the ground. But I'm sure it's not nearly as bad as in places like Europe and in the UK. Yeah, I mean, I have a particular take on safety and security, and I think that there is a lot more hype around that than the reality actually is. And I also think that you, as a person, can kind of attract those things into your life or not. So I mean, I think that whilst one must consider that as important in terms of how, I think, for example, if you make a house, you need to feel safe and happy in that space. But I don't think it comes around making bars and, that kind of thing. So, I mean, for me it's around, I don't quite know how to answer that, because generally speaking, I think that my attitude is that it's not necessarily less safe than in other parts of the world. I think it's about your attitude. And for me, making buildings that are positive, that affirm people, that invite people, that make you feel comfortable and welcome, etc., that you are shifting a mindset rather than designing buildings from a position of fear, which I think it's around, you can operate your life from a position of fear, or you can operate your life from a position that is positive and brings new things and openness in. And I think that's more the position from which I work. Yeah. I think for me, from the beginning when I was studying architecture, A lot of what we get taught comes from a Western kind of mode of thinking and a Western mode of teaching. And I have always been very interested in architecture outside of that. So when I was at university, perhaps things like Islamic architecture, to study something that was from other parts of the world other than the sort of Western tradition. Always very interested also in crafts and in kind of local architecture of a place. So I think also that quite young in my life, I traveled quite a bit to interesting places like India and to other parts of Africa. And I think that is... So, I mean, the kind of architects for me who've always been of great interest was somebody like Hassan Fatih, who was an Egyptian architect who, whilst he made beautiful buildings kind of using very traditional methods, he was also a modernist. So I think that there's a wonderful kind of a move between the two. And I think more recently, my interests has been in quite a lot of the South American architects. I think that they're doing some very interesting work. There is obviously always a thing about a search for what is African architecture. And I mean, I think that's a great challenge for all of us, particularly architects working here in the context of Johannesburg, which is in the broader continent of Africa, and the kind of interest and they're incredibly beautiful aesthetics and spatial kind of understandings, I think, that for me are very interesting in the near parts of the world, in other words, in Africa. Okay, I mean, I think that in the last couple of years things have sort of shifted quite a lot or changed given the kind of economy of how the economies of the world have kind of moved. So historically I've had a practice that's been largely women, so probably at the biggest it's been is about 10 people, myself plus another 9. And interestingly, most of them have historically been women. I think I have a keen interest in that and in kind of furthering, growing women's abilities and within the, historically, I mean, women were not, it's an industry that was not dominated by women at all. So I think it's very valuable. In terms of where we've been, we've recently moved out of the office space that we always used to use, which was a building that I built some time back as a house, but we used it as an office. And I think that, a lot shifted when it was the World Cup. That was a fantastic event this year. So the spaces that we were in, I changed. I made them into hotel kind of accommodation, etc., for the World Cup. And it also became a nice kind of excuse to move out of that space that we've been in, I think, for too long. So we've been a little bit sort of quiet and under the radar, but next year we'll be moving into a more kind of public realm, and without saying too much, but I want to kind of get a very public face on where we're at. Historically, the work that, are you interested in that at all as well, and how that works with the people that we work? So I think what's also happened is that there are, we at the moment are working also in association with other groups of architects, which has been very interesting to do. And interestingly, the one of them that is a very successful relationship is with another woman practice, but people who historically worked for me, and they now have their own practice. So we're now, however many years later, now working collaboratively on public work, which is really very interesting to do.